Our next session is on a very topical subject, COVID-19 and problem gambling. With us today we have two renowned responsible gaming experts, Pieter Remmers and Michael Auer, remotely. There have been many suppositions about what COVID-19 pandemic and resulting lockdowns have meant for problem gambling. But what do we actually know based on the available data? Pieter and Michael are here to enlighten us. Over to you, Pieter. And Michael. Hello, Austria. Do we have a connection?
I hope so.
That's great, Michael. Welcome to Amsterdam.
Great.
How are you?
Hi. Good. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. So you can see Pieter now as well, so I'll leave you to it.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
true. I can see both of us. Anyway, there's no moderator today because when we prepared this session, we thought we should just have a discussion, the two of us on stage. But as you probably know, all of us, at least a lot of people, are not allowed to travel anymore. And what René Jansen said, telling us that this was his first face-to-face live conference whatsoever, that's the same for me as well. And besides that, the only country I've been able to go to in the past 6 months was France, where I was last week for almost a whole week, wearing these mouth caps because anything else was not allowed. Anyway, so maybe we are going to have a bit of a difficulty because remotely, I don't know if you have attended webinars so far, but usually they are boring. Usually they are difficult to have a good interaction between those who are going to speak. Anyway, Willem's 10th conference, I think, thank you very much, Willem, because I think I've been at all of them so far. So number 10, and I do remember that in the beginning we had one small slot in the session, in the whole day sessions, telling something about responsible gambling, so to say. If you look at the program that you have now for today, I think there are 6, maybe even 7 sessions that are dealing with the topic that is called problem gambling or responsible gambling in one way or another. Maybe as a short introduction, for those who don't know me, Pieter Remmers, I'm involved in what I always call the responsible gambling industry for a very long time already. I don't even know what I did before. And maybe Michael should introduce himself before I explain a little bit what we are going to talk about. Is that okay? Michael, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, I can try.
Come on.
So, yeah, I'm from Austria, as Willem already mentioned before. My company is Necton, you see it here in the background. And my specialty is player tracking, identification of problematic play. And we also conduct a lot of research, academic research, together with Professor Mark Griffiths, who I have to mention at this point of time. And we also looked into the effects of COVID on online gambling, especially in Sweden. And that's what Pieter and I am going to talk about.
Okay, we'll start with that. So there was this research project. Mark Griffith, Doris Malichnik was involved as well. She is also from Austria, and Michael Auer. Maybe you could just give it a start. What are the essential points that were brought up in the research program?
So we were looking into sports bettors, and so this research was done with data from an online company called ComeOn. Some of you might be aware of them. So they have 5 online gambling sites licenses in Sweden, and they use our player tracking tool, which is called Mentor. So naturally we have all the data accessible, and we were interested what effect actually the lack of sports betting events had on sports bettors, because as we all know, in Sweden they didn't have like a lockdown, just like similar to other countries. But of course, sports bettors were not able to wager anymore because there was simply no events. So we were wondering, okay, what are they gonna do, right? So will they stop gambling? Will they start to play casino types of games? of course, always within the limitations of the data that we had. So we knew, okay, how much do they wager on those 5 common sites? And I don't know, Peter, maybe you could poll the audience a little bit. So maybe ask them to raise their hand if they think that sports bettors transitioned over to casino gambling, right? So how many in the audience think that
Well, you
sports
can hear
betting?
you can hear the question yourself as well. Eh? So, how many in the audience have changed their behavior from casino games to play sports betting, or
The other way around.
the other way around, from sports betting went back to casino games? Because honestly, I did it the other way. On an occasional basis, I'm interested in Swedish horse racing. So when the lockdown came, there was nothing left except for some football games, I think, in Belarus and another country, but you could still bet on Swedish horse racing. I have an account and I don't bet a lot, but I started to bet a little bit more in the beginning of the lockdown. But okay, it's the other way around. So who went from sports betting playing casino games? Anyone in this room? You can't see them, eh? There's no one raising his hand or her hand. No one. Anyone who... Do you have more questions for the audience?
No, it's good.
Okay, go on.
Okay, anyway, so maybe everybody read our paper then, so...
I don't think so either, so you have to explain a little bit more what's in the paper. I mean, are people going to play more online? If that's the first question? Because everyone expected that when the lockdown was there, where people couldn't go to land-based casinos anymore, they would start to go and play online. That was something regulators were very much afraid of, so to say. Did you see anything related to that?
So regarding the sports bettors, so those players who the 3 months before COVID started, who were heavily involved into sports betting, we of course naturally saw that they couldn't wager anymore, right? So their sports betting revenues of course went down naturally because there were no events. And we did not see any transition to casino gambling. So they did not start to play casino. And secondly, which is very interesting, the sports bettors who played casino games before, they also decreased their casino type involvement. So it wasn't only that the sports bettors played less sports games because they couldn't do it anymore, but they also sort of stopped to play casino type of games. So they didn't play at all anymore.
Hey, so if you look at that, is there any specific reason why people didn't do it?
We didn't have self-reported data, so the only thing, I mean, we can only assume some of the reasons, right, why they stopped to gamble, but we didn't conduct any surveys that would provide any information into their why.
Okay. So, but at the very same time, you say they don't spend more. So, if we translate this to a situation where we think of regulators, I mean, because what we've seen in the past 6 months or so is that a lot of regulators want to take specific measures related to player protection, so to say. Would you say that it was a bit too much what the regulators wanted to do, or would you say that some of the regulators, and maybe we could say the regulators in Great Britain and Sweden, took advantage of the fact that COVID-19 was there and wanted to implement more measures than are necessary?
Well, I mean, of course, I don't know any of the agendas that regulators have. Of the data, for sure, I mean, the real world data, right, that Swedish and also UK regulators have and that our paper was published on, do not show any significant increases in online gambling participation or, increased number of calls to helplines or increased number of, problem players reported by the operators. So none of that basically was happening. However, the COVID situation, of course, is something that the world hasn't seen before, right? So nobody knew, nobody knows what would happen, and especially what the long-term effects would be, right?
Okay.
So in the light of that, okay, it's understandable that regulators are rather careful and basically implement additional measures compared to just, letting everything happen and seeing what's, what eventually will turn out. Because it's sort of an unprecedented situation and you have no idea how people are going to react. I mean, in the short term, at least in the data, we did not see any increased participations. However, nobody knows what's going to happen long term. So from that point of view, it's understandable that some regulators introduced additional restrictions.
Okay. Hey, so what would you then like to suggest regarding the future? Because if you say we have COVID-19 for 6 months, we have done some research, we don't see too many differences related to the past. People are not going to play more, are not going to gamble more, at least not online. So how should we look at it regarding the future and things that are happening? Because everyone is always talking about research and everyone is always talking about evidence-based research. But honestly, I always think when I talk about evidence-based research, then it's really thorough research and it takes a very long time before we know the results, things we would like to know now. I mean, we probably know in 5 years from now. So how should we do research related to the situation that we are in? So what would you like to suggest?
Well, what I think is that, every operator who has every online operator has the data, right? They know exactly what's happening, what has happened, who continued to play, who stopped to play, who played more, right? I mean, it's very easy for each and every operator to do that. And what I'm sort of missing a little bit is that your operators step forward, right? And come forward with information, with data. I mean, it doesn't necessarily be on a granular level, but on a holistic level. And if that would happen, then I think we would have a really good picture of the impacts of COVID. So the operator, I think, should be more involved.
Operators should be more involved. And do you do you have any doubts regarding this, or do you have any doubts regarding the fact that you think that operators in general don't want to be involved?
No, I wouldn't go so far. I mean, certainly, it's always basically a bit of, a cat and mouse game with the regulator and your operators, but I certainly in Europe see, a positive movement towards that direction, especially with regulators requiring specifically of operators, okay, you have to basically interact with players. I mean, you have to identify potentially problematic behaviors like depositing within sessions, etc., etc. Because it's not just about, okay, did the number of active players rise? Of course, the number of active players has risen because more people who basically were at home just tried to play a little bit, right? But on the other hand, the average revenue per user shrunk during the lockdown phases in different countries. So it's a lot about, what are you actually looking at, basically? What metrics are you using? And based on the metrics, you get a completely different perspective of reality.
Okay, hey, so, but if you think of that, if you think of measures that should be taken, if you think of AI, artificial intelligence, would there be a more specific role for artificial intelligence, AI, related to the situation that we are in?
Of course, it's important, to apply AI, to apply analytics, to really observe, what are vulnerable players doing. In order to do that, of course, you need analytics. I mean, you need systems to see, okay, how are they impacted? Do I have to, implement more measures, like, be more strict with the limits that, I impose on the players, or do I have to implement more reality checks For example, let's say in Germany now with the Duldungsphase, I think
Yeah.
from October, if you log in as a player, then they immediately have to show you what did you do over the past 30 days. You know, how much did you lose, how much did you win, how much did you deposit. I think those are really good things. But I mean, your question regarding AI is interesting because AI is based on, you know, data, and you train your AI, right? I mean, I have a Tesla, and of course the Tesla basically learns from past experience, right? From all the Teslas around the world. And basically then it detects, okay, is this an obstacle, you know, is this a whatever, a bicycle, whatever. But let's say a UFO would land in front of me on the road, the Tesla would be pretty confused because it never seen a UFO. So maybe it would run into it, I don't know what it would do, maybe it would turn around scared and drive away. And COVID is a very similar situation. So AI breaks down if the world changes, right? So because it's trained on historical data, and if the historical data doesn't basically contain any of the patterns that are occurring right now, just like the COVID, then you sort of are basically, you have to be careful with the application of the AI because it might give you a completely wrong picture. And then we come back to what you said before, I mean, evidence-based and best practice-based. So here, I mean, you really have to rely on your experience as an operator, how to observe the situation.
Okay, so that in fact means that we are still in a learning situation, a developing situation, and we don't know the answer yet.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I mean, of course, from what you saw, I mean, from the analysis that we did, that, I mean, and operators, of course, know that sports bettors, especially heavily more sports bettors, are very tight-knit community, right?
Yeah.
It's not, you know, very likely that they are just going to take up slot games. I mean, as a general rule, and operators know that it's very difficult to cross-sell to them, you know, other types of games. And that's what we saw now. There are no sports games. Okay, forget it. You know, I stopped gambling. Leave me alone. And if you look at the UKGCs, I mean, you find it on the internet, data that, or I mean, the articles they published. Then you see that in May the involvement increased heavily because then the Deutsche Bundesliga came back, and you know they started their games again, and then involvement basically got up again. So there you see it's very specific, you know. And that's also important from a responsible gambling point of view with respect how you communicate with people. You can't communicate with a sports bettor in the same way that you do with a slot player because they have a completely different, you know, perception
Okay.
of gambling.
Hey, so I was just informed we have 5 minutes left, so maybe a couple of questions related to smaller things, because when you say a question to the room, do sports bettors go to casino games online? No one answered yes. Maybe the question should have been, a better question would have been, what do we know about people that used to play casinos land-based and went online? But there's no research on that. I mean, are you aware of anything or anyone who wrote about that?
No, I mean, what you see is that by no means did you know, registrations on online gambling site compensate in any way, you know, the land-based gambling. So, I mean, of course, online casino operators had more registrations, you know, new customers coming in, but by no means was it, you know, basically a really, you know, a significant proportion of the land-based players.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
one thing, Peter, quickly I want to mention, because we didn't say it at all. What research shows is that apart from gambling, I mean, the COVID has significant impact on people's mental health, right?
Okay.
People report, you know, more depression, more anxiety of loss of job and so on and so forth, and, you know, isolation, everything. So that's something, I mean, WHO did studies and Mark did, I mean, numerous studies on that. So that's something that's really basically looming, right? I mean, if you think of gambling, that's such a small percentage of people who do it, right? I mean, the prevalence rates are ridiculous. But everybody or a lot of people are affected by much, you know, more serious things like depression, anxiety, you know, like mental health is heavily impacted across society.
So what you say, in fact, is don't make the problem bigger than it is. Is that correct? So are we, is there a kind of overexposure for gambling and the problems that go with it? Because there are bigger problems when we talk about the situation and COVID-19 we are in at this moment.
I wouldn't say bigger problems, but of course, I mean, people, I mean, you have, alcohol abuse. I mean, people report, more online activity, online shopping, so social media, etc. I mean, there are a lot of things basically that can and of course hopefully are monitored that are evenly, could impact people even the same way as sort of a problematic gambling.
Okay. Hey, the last question before we have maybe questions, or at least we stop. If there's anything related to research that you would like to do, related to research and COVID, the situation that we are in, what would be the most interesting topic that you would like to do research on?
Good question.
Yeah, we didn't prepare this one, eh? I mean. I mean, basically, you are you are very much involved in research, and if you don't use the moment that we have now, you're too late.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, it's of course always the combination between self-reported data and actual gambling behavior, right? Because I mean, if you look at self-reported data, very often people have no idea what they're actually doing, right? So they tell you something and they do in reality something completely different. And that's something, I mean, of course, we have done, we have done surveys, we have polled, players, we connected with the data, and that's of course an ongoing process to basically better understand, okay, what impact it has, not only short term, but of course also long term.
Okay, and then the focus would be on best practice, because it takes too much time to do evidence-based research.
Of course, I mean, you roll back, right, to a more careful approach. Your operators, hopefully, or regulators are advising, okay, it's rather, do more than less, right? I mean, that's basically the policy that should be in place.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know how. Oh, Willem.
I'm joining you on stage here, Pieter.
Very good.
Great to have you, Michael.
Thanks a lot.
Some questions in Slido, some questions from the room. As I said, we have a boom operator. For the people who just joined the stream, please download the Slido app. The QR code is on the screen. And you can participate in the Q&A virtually. And let's see, the first question. Generally speaking, how open are operators to using data to improve their responsible gambling policies and procedures? So, generally speaking, how open are operators to using data to improve their responsible gambling policies and procedures? Michael, Pieter?
Do you start, Michael? I mean,
Sure.
This is part of your daily job.
Yep.
And I can only talk about impressions.
So our player tracking system runs on about 40 different online gambling sites, and it doesn't only basically track player behavior, but it sends messages to players and alerts to players, right? So if we think somebody shows a problematic behavior, we inform the player about that. And that's basically something that happens automatically. The operator, of course, is involved because it's their system, but and I think, I mean, that's almost as far as you can go. So I would say, in general, the operators, at least who we work with, and those are all, European licensed operators, they are very much involved and, motivated to improve the gambling experience.
Great.
I agree to a certain extent, because the ones you are working with are the motivated operators who really care about responsible gambling and the things that go with it. And honestly, when I look at it and all those years of experience, I think if you reach, should I say 10% of all the operators that are there who are happy to deal their information with research organizations, you're probably close to the truth, so to say, because most of them are still very much afraid to share the data and the knowledge related to what customers, players are doing.
Great. Maybe any questions from the room? Again, we have a boom operator here to answer any questions we have in the room. Please raise your hand if you have a question. Do we have more questions in Slido? Jeroen, maybe one quick last question before we wrap up this session. No question? Oh yes, here. Do you think problematic gambling increased during the initial lockdowns? So we talk about the more broad observation by you, Michael, but in the initial lockdowns?
No.
Okay.
We don't see you anymore.
Short question, short answer, that's what we asked for. Pieter and Michael, thank you for... Sorry?
No, otherwise I mean,
Yes?
what I think, one thing it's very difficult to have conclusions regarding if the problem did get bigger. At the very same time, as we have noticed, what Michael said related to his research, but what I always think related to the situation and the news and the information that I got from different countries is if there was an increase, it was a slight increase. And what you do see, and if you look at the report of the UK Gambling Commission, it went down already again in July, so to say. So I think it's very difficult to have conclusions. Yeah.
Okay. We still have a last quick question here from Eric. Any perspective? Any perspective on this shift from your experiences or professional point of view?
Are you there, Michael?
Yeah, I'm there. Well, I mean, I'm just reading this question. So somebody asking that, you know, amongst the land-based players, the number of players that also play online doubled during the closure of land-based properties. Shall I answer this question?
Well, I guess it was a FYI. If you want to say something about it quickly, Michael, that'd be great, and then we wrap up the session.
Okay. So, I mean, maybe some of you are not aware, but we did a study, and this study also showed that, you know, players who used limits were, you know, more loyal. So lifetime basically propensity value and duration of you know, customer relation was longer for those who had limits. So that's also something, you know, that I think it's important for the broader audience to know that, you know, responsible gambling is not something that should only limit players, but we know, I mean, we've seen that it actually can be enhance, you know, customer relation.
Great. This really wraps up the session. Pieter here in Amsterdam, Michael from Austria, thank you for participating and look forward to see you soon.
Bye.